If they're unhappy that these people are being detained under the Alien Enemies Act, they can file a petition for a writ of habeas corpus saying that we are illegally and lawfully detaining them. That's their mechanism. They don't get to file a civil complaint lawsuit in your courtroom and then you reverse everything. That's not the mechanism, the jurisdiction that you have.
What it requires is Congress to basically issue a resolution saying this judge is acting outside of his scope of conduct, he's engaged in misconduct, and is not engaged in good conduct right now.
President Trump now demanding Republicans do something, step in here and help him out a little bit. We've got judges all across the country issuing nationwide injunctions stopping the president from enacting his agenda. We all voted for it to be enacted on day one, and the judges are stealing our time away from us, and we've got to do something about it. So the president came out with two truths on this, and we also have some developments like this one, H.R. 1526, which was introduced by Darrell Issa, and the Judiciary Committee is talking about it. But here's what Trump said, largely in response to Judge James Boasberg. This is the judge who ordered the planes with Tren de Aragua terrorists to be flown back into the United States so that they could run free and not be deported because they hate President Trump. So he says, look, Judge James Boasberg is doing everything in his power to usurp the power of the presidency. He is a local, unknown judge, a grandstander looking for publicity, and it cannot be for any other reason because his rulings are so ridiculous and inept. Save America. And he's saying that unlawful nationwide injunctions by radical left judges could very well lead to the destruction of our country. These people are lunatics who do not care even a little bit about the repercussions from their very dangerous and incorrect decisions and rulings. Lawyers endlessly search the United States for these judges and file lawsuits as quickly as they find them. It is then the obligation of law-abiding agencies of government to have these orders, in quote, overturned. The danger is unparalleled. These judges want to assume the powers of the presidency without having to attain 80 million votes. They want all of the advantages with none of the risks. Again, a president has to be allowed to act quickly and decisively about such matters as returning murderers, drug lords, rapists, and others, criminals, back to their homeland and to other locations that will allow our country to be safe. It is our goal to make America great again. And such a high aspiration can never be done if radical and highly partisan judges are allowed to stand in the way of justice. Stop nationwide injunctions now, before it is too late. If Justice Roberts and the United States Supreme Court do not fix this toxic and unprecedented situation immediately, our country is in very serious trouble. And he's right, John Roberts should get control of his branch of government and stop the madness because they're tiptoeing on a very dangerous line. And so this case involves this guy, Judge James Boasberg, appointed by Barack Obama, served on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and now is handling this U.S. alien terrorist removal case. Close friends, I'm sure, with Judge Beryl Howell and the rest of them out of the D.C. circuit, all operating to stop Trump. Now, Jim Jordan, who leads the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives, said, you know, Darrell Issa might have a solution to this thing. He has a bill that would stop radical judges from imposing nationwide injunctions on Trump's agenda, which 77 million Americans voted for, saying, we passed that bill out of the Judiciary Committee, and so let's make sure we can get it to President Trump's desk. And that's a very short bill. Here's what it looks like. Perhaps the solution to stopping these reckless judges and their nationwide injunctions is H.R. 1526, a bill introduced by Darrell Issa and others from California. He says to amend Title 28 of the U.S. Code, says all we got to do is this. We're going to call it the NORA Act, No Rogue Rulings Act. And all it does is limit the authority on district courts and what they can do with injunctions. So they amend the law to say, notwithstanding any provision of the law, no United States district court shall issue any order providing for injunctive relief, except in the case of such an order that is applicable only to limit the actions of a party to the case before such district court with respect to the party seeking injunctive relief from such district court. Very simple. All it's saying is that you can't go outside the parties in the building. So in the Alien Enemies Act case, there were a slew of people who sued, and what the judge did is expand it beyond those people who sued, right? There were 5 or so illegal immigrants or aliens or whatever their status was, we don't really know, but they were deported. And the judge said, actually, they were not deported. The judge actually expanded the scope beyond them and said that everybody else, even besides them, could not be deported, right? So it was much broader than the people who actually filed the lawsuit. And we've seen this before too. We saw this with Judge Amir Ali, the USAID case, the judge who was born in Ontario or from Ontario. He came in and people sued and said, you canceled our contracts. He said, well, all USAID contracts are coming back to the tune of $2 billion. even though the people who were suing only had a couple dozen $1 million that they were owed, allegedly. So there is a limitation there. Now, I wonder if this would prevent what Judge Boasberg did, which is just certifying those people as a class, right? He just turned it into a class action lawsuit. So it would limit it to the actions of a party, but what if these courts just call them class actions? So they might want to amend that or revise that or think that through, because Judge Boasberg already got around that. He just said, oh, it's just a class action lawsuit. And now it covers everybody in the whole country. So might want to think about that. But we had this case happening today. So yesterday in the Judge Boasberg case, we saw the judge ordered the administration to respond or else, and said, give me your answer by noon about whether the cabinet has actually been talking about invoking the state's secret privilege. Of course, the Department of Justice complied. They said August E. Flentje, acting director over at the Civil Division, submitted this. Says, all right, Judge, you want a declaration? Here it is. It is now attached, and guess who it came from? Our boy Todd Blanche, baby, back in the house. So Todd Blanche signed this one, sent it into the court. Todd Blanche, writing down here, said this: I am the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. I am submitting this declaration pursuant to Judge Boasberg's order, saying on March 20th, the government submitted a declaration from Robert L. Cerna, which stated the following: I understand that cabinet secretaries are currently actively considering whether to invoke the state secret privilege over other facts requested by the court's order. The court is trying to catch Trump in a lie or in a violation of the court's order, saying, I ordered you to turn the planes back and they didn't, right? When did the order come down? Why didn't you call them and tell the pilots, bring those terrorists back to the country? You violated an order. This will lead to contempt or sanctions, which will then lead to a call for impeachment, and they'll demand it at some point. So it's just the impeachment trap. They're waiting for the right one. Now, doing so, wrote yesterday Robert Cerna, is a serious matter, and it requires careful consideration of national security and foreign relations. It cannot be properly undertaken in just 24 hours. And the judge was not happy about that word. I understand, he said. You don't know? You weren't a party to these conversations? Well, who was? So then he said, go find somebody in the cabinet who can actually explain what's happening. So then they went and got Todd Blanche, Deputy AG. Senate confirmed. Says, I attest to the accuracy of those statements based on personal knowledge of the events, including my direct involvement in ongoing cabinet-level discussions regarding invocation of the state secret privilege. So there you go, Judge. I declare under penalty of perjury, the foregoing is true and correct. Signed, Todd Blanche, Deputy AG. What's up, Todd? So that got submitted today, and then we had a hearing. So the judge ordered a hearing today, and Margot Cleveland was listening in and gave us a tidbit on what happened inside the courtroom. The judge came out, this guy, and started drilling the attorneys. He said, oh, it's nice to see you here. Where were you yesterday when we had this other hearing about this? And the DOJ said, well, Your Honor, you certified this as a class action, and you said that even more are now subject to the proclamation. And the judge said, well, and I did not order anyone released or that you couldn't deport anyone via regular proceedings. He says, well, I think you kind of did because it's a class action. Well, he says, well, I think it's important to the public to make these facts clear, because the DOJ sounds like the DOJ was saying, well, you said we can't deport anybody because you made it a class, and the class covers the whole country. So I guess we can't. So all the terrorists are here because you ordered them here. Says, we've complied with your court order. And we have a nice meme there, Boasberg. I'm the personification of belligerent judicial elitism. This guy. Reyes, the judge, I think from Uruguay, something. Hold my Chardonnay, she says, or hold my pronouns, yeah. Says, so she got kicked out of the courtroom, couldn't come back. She gets back in. The DOJ was distinguishing between what is reviewable and what is not, but argues that look, Judge, in other words, if they're unhappy that these people are being detained under the Alien Enemies Act, they can file a petition for a writ of habeas corpus saying that we are illegally and lawfully detaining them. That's their mechanism. They don't get to file a civil complaint lawsuit in your courtroom and then you reverse everything. That's not the mechanism, the jurisdiction that you have. The judge says, well, Al-Qaeda even required proof that they were members of Al-Qaeda if they were being held in Gitmo. He says, well, there's habeas available. So just they can go through habeas. He says, well, okay, fine, the judge. Let's talk about habeas. If that is the sole avenue of review, since they were dismissed, it seems that while it has taken place in habeas, they were challenging detention. In what case were they not? The DOJ says, well, there were international cases. People used habeas and we removed them to another country in these other cases. And their challenge is that the government can't exercise authority under the AEA, but we can. Judge says, well, if folks like that type are entitled to some sort of hearing, aren't they? What is the standard of review to determine whether they're members of a gang? Like, how do we decide, okay, they're members of a gang so we can get rid of them? DOJ says, well, there's no clear case law on that, Judge. It's generalized principles, but the review from the legal system, from the courts, is deferential to the executive, right? That's a decision for the executive to make. The courts don't make that decision. We do. Well, what is the role of the court to make sure that people aren't removed from the country? Habeas, Judge. There are habeas courts, and they're in Texas, and they're addressing those right now. These claims are being resolved in habeas claims, including all of their constitutional complaints. Well, are you saying that national security concerns won't be a problem? Well, it's not an issue for me, but it's in habeas court, so they can go there. Well, what if it is a national security issue? You can go to the ATRC or something. Your Honor, that's never been used previously. But just because another tool doesn't mean the AEA isn't allowed. So due process rights of aliens are very limited to those provided by the statutes. Well, the court says the Fifth Amendment guarantees to aliens rights to due process, right? Well, only what Congress provides to them under the Fifth Amendment. So aren't you precluding due process then? So you're saying they don't have due process? You're only saying there's habeas? Well, some issues they can't challenge, right? So facial claims is likelihood of success on the merits. If they want to file a habeas claim, they may. All these plaintiffs here, they can. But this suit is not an appropriate manner to resolve this. They can't sue under the APA. Merely implementing the president's directions means you can't be sued. And the ability to raise habeas claims means they can't sue under the APA. They can sue under the APA if they have no other mechanism, but they do. It's habeas. She says, she summarizes it for us. Thank you, Margot. Says, bottom line, you can't bring in a habeas claim. You can't bring implied causes of actions in courts of equity. Well, what about a CAT claim? Well, it's a habeas claim, Your Honor, because they're saying you can't use the AEA claim, the Aliens Act, to exercise control over me. The judge said, well, I just want to know the facts about what happened here. Well, we intend to comply with your court order. Well, I'm talking about habeas. Then Margot gets a Trende Aragua lawyer, right? I like how she's calling them TDA lawyers. We call them gangbanger lawyers here because they love gangbangers. Anyways, government doesn't give us time, Your Honor. The government doesn't even give us time to file habeas complaints. By the time we want to sue, then they're already out of the country. So it's illusory. So they're already gone. They're already in Venezuela prisons. Like, we're never going to get them back. The government is asking you to look at 50 years of law and reconsider what we've been doing for 50 years. The core question for habeas is about release. Yes, it could be brought in habeas, but doesn't mean we can't bring it in non-habeas ways. Now, how do you see this process playing out, says the judge to the TDA gangbanger lawyers. Do members have to request a hearing? Does the government have to provide a hearing? Like, how does it work? Gangbang TDA lawyer says, well, it's uncharted territory, Your Honor, but before we had a hearing board. Now, at minimum, there must be a meaningful challenge. If the court upholds the TRO, we would ask for more time to think about how this procedure would work. So we don't really know how it would work. Well, what would the venue be? Where would you guys hold these cases, like under your strategy? Well, these are all fair and hard questions, but we still don't think it needs to be brought in habeas. Okay, well, it's not habeas. What kind of claim is it? This one? So it would be more like an administrative hearing followed by judicial review, right? So the judge is now saying, well, they say they're gangbangers and they need a hearing to determine, like, so what kind of process do you envision? Well, it should be like an administrative hearing and then the court should review it. So they have to follow that. Should the TRO, the judge says, if I issue this, should it be narrowed to exclude individuals who admit or don't challenge that they're members of Trend? Well, there must be a process, the gangbang lawyers, that allows TDA to understand the process, to talk to attorneys and to understand the consequences. So these gangbangers can get lawyers and, all their rights and maybe like a hotel too. Okay, the judge says, well, what's your position on the modification of the TRO? We must be able to contest that you were covered by the proclamation. So we must be able to say they're actually not TDA. But the threshold question of can the act be used in this way, it must be reviewable. Now, Margot says, yeah, I've been criticizing Boasberg, but he's demonstrating judicial temperament. Sounds like he's being reasonable today. The TDA lawyers say they are only poor little low-level terrorists. Wow. They are only poor little low-level terrorists. So the judge says, so they say to the judge, just leave the TRO in place and let's see how the circuit decides it. Well, the judge says, well, why can't they challenge that government has never allowed them to bring a CAT claim? Well, of course they can bring those claims. Well, there was a third plaintiff, folks, that weren't really sent to El Salvador pursuant to the removal order. We have to state where they are. And this lawyer says they also haven't returned some people to us. The judge asked the DOJ, well, where is that third plane? Your Honor, everyone on the third plane had final orders of removal from judges in court, so they're gone. Well, I may require more specific information because Trend de Aragua is raising a reasonable concern. Like, so you can just say that they're TDA and they're just gone? Like, what if they're not? If the DOJ will have individual hearings to ensure that Venezuelans are TDA. No, Your Honor, we don't need individual hearings to make that determination. We've made that determination, and if they want to challenge it, then they can fight it in habeas. It provides whatever relief is appropriate, so we're not going to be doing pre-hearings for terrorists to give them due process. Well, just because they say we could bring it in habeas doesn't mean we have to bring it in habeas, Your Honor. There's other case law. Just because there's habeas availability doesn't mean that there's not jurisdiction here. The president's determination of war or invasion and other things, that's not for the court to decide, but the court should afford due process here. And the judge goes back to the government and says, you have to admit it's very frightening what this terrorist lawyer is positing that a president could do. Your Honor, that's why it's entrusted to political branches. And Congress could address that. If they don't like it, if the president is acting a fool, Congress can impeach it. Congress can address it. Gangbanger lawyer says, you need to suggest that the court could put class certification in writing as well. Boasberg isn't nearly done figuring out if Trump violating the order or what to do. And merits, I expect him to rule he has jurisdiction. Given the DC Circuit precedent, it appears better to rule is any challenge must be brought in habeas, which then means there is no jurisdiction in Boasberg's case, right? He can't hear it. In habeas, the questions about applicability of the Alien Enemy Act are many and complex. And finally, given the individualized assessments needed to determine if they're removable, this case should not have been certified as a class either, right? So that happened. Other House representatives are introducing articles of impeachment, and this one came out against Theodore Chwang, who was the same judge who we've covered here before, a Democrat who has been attacking Trump in multiple opinions. So this representative said, we now have articles of impeachment against Theodore Chwang from Maryland because this judge has been presiding over cases involving Trump. In fact, he issued a memo in the case of the John or Jane Does versus Elon Musk saying you have to hire back all of the fired employees and reinstate access to emails and payments and security. And he, without any Article 2 authority, which vests power in the President of the United States, seized it and mandated that they get hired back. Also, violating the separation of powers in a patent way, saying we've got to disperse funds to organizations that are linked to foreign terrorist organizations and more. In fact, he's mandating, this judge, Chwang, is mandating the immediate provision of access to government systems without regard to anything the president has requested. He mandated this access back to USAID. And we know that a report indicates that USAID did not ensure awards went to Gaza and didn't go to terrorism. In fact, in November 24, USAID was found to have financed hundreds of thousands of meals for Al-Qaeda fighters in Syria. Now, while arguing that Trump and the reorganization is causing irreparable harm, this judge is facilitating terrorism in Syria. Unbelievable. So accordingly, Chwang has engaged in conduct so lacking in due concern for the separation of powers, so lacking in care for the national security of America, that he should and is guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, is unfit to hold the office of federal judge, and should be removed from office. And it sounds like he is aiding and abetting terrorism. Certainly sounds like a high crime and misdemeanor to me. Someone else on the engagement train is Arizona Representative Andy Biggs. Here's what he had to say about all this.
Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution allows Congress to limit jurisdiction, and that's what we're doing. So I have a legislation that would limit the jurisdiction of federal district courts to only the litigants before them and the case before them, so you couldn't issue nationwide injunctions, Harris. We're talking about impeachment. We're talking about defunding certain courts and jurisdictional limitation on courts and the areas that they can rule in. But I want to point out something. Most people think that federal judges have lifetime tenure. Everybody is told that, but that's not accurate. Article 3, Section 1 is very clear that they only get to have their job during a tenure of good, and this is the quote, good behavior. And when you're abusing your power for political purposes, you have violated that clause and you are subject to termination from your job as a federal judge. And that doesn't even require impeachment, Harris. What it requires is Congress to basically issue a resolution saying this judge is acting outside of his scope of conduct, he's engaged in misconduct, and is not engaged in good conduct right now.
Yeah, we saw that promoted on X by Andrew Branca, Law of Self-Defense as well. Nice to hear it out of Congress because, of course, they're the ones who have the power to do that. So nice to hear that from Andy Biggs, and shout out to Branca. We also heard Tammy Bruce, who was explaining these deportations are necessary. She's the State Department spokeswoman who works alongside Rubio. Here's the latest from her.
South and Central America, convincing people on the merits of our argument about national security and sovereignty and the importance of nations taking back, repatriating their own citizens who've been in America illegally and have been committing crimes against the American people. So it is diplomacy. It is also about the Department of Homeland Security. It is about President Trump's vision as we move forward to make America safe, secure, and prosperous as we make America great again. That's the big takeaway this week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, State Department under Marco Rubio and Tammy Bruce. We appreciate those developments and we agree. Now, these judges continue to attack Trump and America, trying to take him out, but Secretary Howard Lutnick was explaining the true nature of the president and why coming after him not going to work out well for you.
About Donald Trump. He was the most famous, the most fun, the most interesting person 30 years ago. I mean, here's the best thing. He's been on the cover of Time magazine 59 times.
No way.
And then he leans over to me and he goes, and 20 were good. I'm like, but who can take that? I mean, who could take, like, other people, when you have a bad cover of Time magazine, you'd crumple, right, and be sand on the floor. And said, he's like.
But so, Howard, is it that he's just totally wired to understand that moment, like, of being a public figure? Or, like, what is it that's so unique about what constitutes the ability to navigate that over 40 years?
I think it adds energy to him. Right? So everybody else's energy, what they don't understand is people bring negative energy to Donald Trump, right? And they're just charging his battery. Okay? Your energy around him comes to him. So when I come at him with a lot of energy, he comes back with a lot of energy. Right? It doesn't matter. He never steps back. He just sort of takes it like the centrifuge and then hurls it back at you. And he's been that way always. So this is not new.
This is just who he is.
This is who he is. So those other people who attack him, they think they're attacking him. They're charging his battery. They're literally charging his battery. So he comes back bigger, stronger. And once you understand the man, the most intuitive person that you've ever met. And people say, well, okay, so people who know me, I don't suffer fools. And they have all these derogatory, all my left liberal friends, all these derogatory statements about the guy, right? And they know me really well, right? And they'd say, well, how can you work for him? The most intuitive person. He senses it. He knows it.
Interesting conversation. That came out from the All In podcast and sounds like a great conversation. So go check the rest of that out over from those guys. But Howard Lutnick explaining how Trump works, and that resonates with what we've seen here in practice. Everybody who comes at him gets overwhelmed, and it's been going on for years. And the Democrats still haven't figured it out. They're doubling down. They've got AOC and others trying to seize this mantle, see how it works out for them. But we'll be here continuing to cover this one, and we'll hope the Republicans spring into action and assist this administration and their country.